Prior to the 17th century, Russo-Indian contacts were sporadic and generally fruitless. Russian manuscripts do speak of the arrival of a Mughal embassy to Moscow in 1532, but that was as far as official diplomatic contacts went for the 16th century. No one knows the details of the venture, and it was recorded as a mission sent in the name of Babur, who had already died by 1532. In 1553, Ivan IV of Russia attempted to reciprocate the embassy of 1532, to no avail. After his reign, Russia entered a period of crisis, foreign invasions, and civil strife that only ended in the early 17th century. Aware of the impoverished nature of their country, Russian Tsars were eager to acquire a share of India's vast market, which other Europeans already had access to. To them, India was a land of rubies and diamonds and other untold riches. But the Russians had no naval capabilities to travel by sea. And Russian knowledge of the land routes to India in this era was still lackluster and mostly dependent on the accounts of Marco Polo and Afanasy Nikitin. Therefore, the Indians reached Russia first, not the other way around. Since the Middle Ages, merchants from North India frequented bazaars in Persia, Bokhara, Balkh, Badakhshan, Samarkand, and Khiva. So it was only a matter of time before they seek trade in lands to the north. One of these first merchants to settle in Russia was a certain man named Sutur, from Mughal India. Sometime in the 1620s, Sutur arrived at Astrakhan, a Russian colony situated on the Caspian coast and surrounded by the Tibetan Buddhist kingdom of Kalmykia. While there, Sutur appreciated the rule of law imposed by the authoritarian czars. When he faced harassment from a Russian official, the government immediately had the offending official dismissed. By 1646 or 1647, Sutur felt secure enough in Russia to invite 25 of his relatives and friends to Astrakhan. Together, they would eventually form the basis of Astrakhan's influential Indian community, which rapidly grew during the second half of the 17th century. A key event was Persia's simultaneous victory over Russia and Mughal India during the wars of the 1650s. Though there likely wasn't any direct coordination between the Russians and Mughals, the new order allowed Indians to increase their hold on the transit trade between Persia and Russia. This meant Indian merchants in Astrakhan were selling Persian or Uzbek products instead of Indian products, for the most part. Nonetheless, Russian czars could now enjoy Indian luxury items, silks, textiles, fabrics, and cotton, and their appetite for more Indian goods grew insatiable. Once again, they seeked out direct and reciprocal trade with Mughal India, now possible because of a friendlier Persia. The process already started during the reign of Shah Jahan. 3 Russian missions were sent his way, but none ever reached his court. In 1675, a Russian expedition led by a Tatar, Muhammad Yusuf Kasimov, did make it to Mughal Kabul by way of Central Asia. But Emperor Aurangzeb was disinterested in his worthless gifts and paid him to leave. Finally, in the 1690s, Peter the Great sent the ambassador Semyon Malinki to Aurangzeb again. His team traveled through Persia this time, then set sail from Bandar Abbas to Surat, Gujarat, in one of the first Russian expeditions in the Indian Ocean. Malinki ventured onwards to Agra, where he met Aurangzeb. After 2 decades, Aurangzeb's attitude had changed and he now allowed Russians to conduct free trade anywhere in Mughal India. Taking advantage of this arrangement, Malinki spent several years in India and was able to make some observations about Indian society and culture. According to one of his companions, the Indian people were quiet, affectionate, courteous, and friendly. The Russians eventually departed India, laden with valuable goods. In return, the Indians began to import Russian furs and metal objects, a trade that lasted into the 18th century. Malinki died in Persia around 1702, but his companions lived to tell the story to Peter the Great, thereby heightening the Russian government's interest in trade with India. Henceforth, Peter accordingly granted Van Meulen's Indian Trading Company the right to resolve property disputes by their own customs in 1722 to 1723. And he considered opening up the Chinese and German markets to the Indians, through Russian land routes. The meeting also gives an idea of the level of unity among the Indians of Astrakhan, since most were Hindus from the Mughal city of Multan in modern-day Pakistan. Others came from Mughal Sindh, Gujarat, and the Rajput kingdom of Marwar. There's even evidence of trade between the Maratha Confederacy and Russia. Regardless, the Indians generally operated as a cohesive unit in Astrakhan, allowing them to outcompete other foreigners and import at 3 times the value of Armenian merchants. Unlike the Armenians, who worked in a system closely intertwined with the Persians and their restrictions, the Indians focused more on banking and money lending than trade. Some lent money to Turks from the Ottoman Empire, while others helped Russian peasants with financial security in the upper Volga region between Astrakhan and Moscow. In fact, the Indians were the most active foreign merchants in the routes between those 2 cities, something frequently noted in Dutch, English, or German accounts of the region during the 18th century. This can partially be attributed to the unique privileges the Indians enjoyed there in comparison to Persia or Central Asian countries. In the 1720s, the Russian Senate explicitly ordered the governor of Astrakhan to assist the Indians and show kindness and goodwill to them. All officials who refused to comply were not to be tolerated. On top of that, Indian merchants in Astrakhan were exempt from duties, granted complete religious freedom, and paid only 12 rubles a year for renting shops. This was a stark change in policy from the 1680s, when the government imposed taxes of thousands of rubles on the Indians, partly because Russia wished to trade with India directly. As it turned out, the Russian government was still keen to establish newer and better routes to India even after Malinki's trade deal. For this reason, Khwarezm was invaded in 1717, not only for its gold, but also because of its proximity to India. Years later, Peter the Great authorized an expedition to Madagascar in order to access Mughal Indian trade by sea, however his death rendered the voyage pointless. Either way, the overland trade to Russia itself was always of more value to the Indians. Estimates suggest that Indians made up 3% of Astrakhan's population, but controlled half of the shops and 25% of the annual trade, amounting to over 100,000 rubles per year. A prominent Indian merchant, Sukanant Dharamdas, was said to have possessed an estate worth 300,000 rubles. At a time when Russian merchants could only cough up 1,000 rubles in good circumstances. He first reached Russia via Astrakhan and later died in Moscow during the 1750s. Perhaps Sukanant's ship from Astrakhan to the area around Moscow signifies a decline in the importance of Astrakhan over time, no doubt a consequence of changes in the geopolitical landscape. The first half of the 18th century was, after all, a period of turmoil for Persia, the vital link between India and Russia. Relations between Russia and Persia worsened, prompting Persia to invade Russia in 1719 and sack Astrakhan. Following several back-and-forth wars between Persia and its enemies, the Russians agreed to a tenuous alliance with Persia. Therefore, Russia received a share of the plunder that Nader Shah collected from Delhi after he decisively defeated the Mughals and their allies at the Battle of Karnal. That campaign, as brazen as it was, effectively ended any hopes for the Mughals to stay a regional power. But the Persians did not get the last laugh. Their empire collapsed into pieces after the death of Nader Shah. In the aftermath, Multan, the city crucial to the production of Indian merchants in Astrakhan, fell to the Afghan Empire. General instability in Persia rendered the route to Astrakhan via the Caspian unviable anyways, so the route across Central Asia took precedence again. The cities of the Orenburg line were now the main centers of Indian trade and settlement in Russia. In the 1770s, the Maratha Confederacy sent around 1,000 Gujaratis to Orenburg in Russia. Meanwhile, the Indian population of Astrakhan dropped to less than 100, but they were still important enough to catch the attention of a German explorer in the 1770s. In his book, he wrote, "They have all the qualities of good money lenders. The interest they charge is no higher than that permitted by law, and they do not oppress their debtors. The people who have fallen into poverty due to no fault of their own, they not only treat with respect, but often also assist them. And they try to do this in secret, as such good deeds, according to their faith, is of great value. They are all prosperous and some are rich in capital. Nonetheless, the population and economic influence of the Indians continue to dwindle, correlating with the growth of British power in India. The anti-British press in Russia exhibited great interest in India and its tragic struggle against the British. In 1800, Tsar Paul of Russia took note of these developments, and secretly conspired with France to liberate India from the British. The elaborate plan called for a descent into India with 70,000 men, plus Central Asian and Indian allies. French troops were to be transported along the Danube and the Black Sea to join Russians north of the Caucasus, then the combined army would sail across the Caspian to Persia. Simultaneously, Russian Cossacks would march directly to India through Central Asia. Russian strategists took great care to ensure the Kazakh Khanate and Tashkent Khanate would allow their passage, and even supply additional manpower or resources if necessary. Finally, the two forces would reach friendly Maratha territory and help the Marathas fight the British. Unfortunately, like with Peter the Great's African expedition, Paul's Indian expedition was cut short by his own death, right after Russian Cossacks began their movements. In the decades to come, the British East India Company colonized much of the Indian subcontinent, thereby halting the stream of Indian travelers to Russia. Contacts between India and Russia were to remain minimal until the mid-20th century. However, neither the Russian nor the Indian governments ever forgot about the early modern connections. While in Brazil in 2014, Prime Minister Narendra Modi told Vladimir Putin, "We in Gujarat have a feeling that Astrakhan is very close to us." While in Astrakhan, I visited a library and saw chronicles from India. It was a surprise to see these kinds of documents from India there. I had the feeling then that these two regions, Astrakhan and Gujarat, are very close to each other culturally. There is a building in Astrakhan called the Indian House. It turned out that in those days when merchants from Gujarat traveled to Astrakhan, this was the place where they stayed. Now the people of Astrakhan are very proud to show us how they preserved and looked after this building, end quote. Today, Gujarat's largest city and Astrakhan are twin cities, a status with both economic and historically symbolic connotations that remind the populations of Russo-Indian ties during the Tsarist, Mughal, and Maratha eras. Thanks for watching.